The bouquet of fresh red tulips sat steady in my right grip as I stood outside the executive conference suite on the top floor of Apex Global Logistics headquarters. I was 54 years old, and 25 years of building this company's global supply network from the ground up had taught me that genuine professional respect mattered far more than temporary corporate titles. I had purchased the vibrant flowers at 6 o'clock that morning from a small corner market near the commercial shipping harbor, intending a simple, warm gesture to welcome Victoria Thorne, our newly appointed Chief Executive Officer. I wanted her very first morning at headquarters to feel like she was joining an established operational family rather than stepping into an adversarial corporate battlefield. My name is Raymond Vance, and as the Senior Vice President of Global Logistics and Operations, I had weathered every imaginable storm in this building. I had managed midnight supply chain rescues across 3 continents, navigated complex international customs disputes, and guided our cargo fleets through historical labor strikes. Over 2 decades, my life had become intertwined with the rhythm of container ships, freight manifests, and emergency dispatch war rooms. But as I pushed open the heavy, frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom on that humid Thursday morning, the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop instantaneously. Victoria Thorne did not smile when I entered. She did not glance at the vibrant red flowers cradled carefully in my arm, nor did she acknowledge my polite morning greeting. Seated at the head of the polished 20-foot mahogany conference table, she deliberately adjusted her tailored charcoal designer jacket, her dark eyes cold, flat, and completely unyielding. Arrayed around the long glass table were 2 newly promoted executive vice presidents and several junior board representatives, their hands poised stiffly over leather binders, as though anticipating a carefully rehearsed corporate spectacle. "Raymond Vance, your time at Apex Global Logistics is officially over," Victoria declared. Her voice was sharp, resonant, and completely devoid of human warmth, cutting through the quiet morning air like a surgical blade. The words hung suspended in the room, heavy and surreal. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process the sentence. I stood frozen near the doorway, waiting for a slight softening of her mouth or a betraying flicker of irony that would signal a tasteless corporate joke. None came. Victoria leaned forward, her manicured fingers pressing against a thick manila folder resting on the polished wood. With a calculated, deliberate motion, she slid the envelope across the table until it rested directly in front of my empty chair. "This termination is effective immediately," she continued, her voice rising slightly so that every staff member standing near the glass partition could hear every single syllable clearly. "This executive decision marks the mandatory beginning of our comprehensive cultural reform. Apex Global Logistics must shed its obsolete relics if we are to remain competitive in modern global markets. Raymond's public departure today will serve as our definitive operational signal of structural change." A quiet gasp rippled through the gathered junior executives. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room fixed upon me. It was not a look of professional critique, but a devastating mixture of awkward pity, embarrassment, and helpless shock. 25 years of unblemished service, of sacrificed weekends, canceled family vacations, and overnight shifts in freight terminals had been stripped away in less than 30 seconds. My arms felt heavy, and the bouquet of red tulips suddenly seemed absurd, drooping slightly in my numb fingers. I carefully set the flowers down on a mahogany-side credenza, their subtle fragrance heavy in the stale air-conditioned space. I reached slowly for the manila envelope. As my right hand moved, my thumb brushed against the heavy silver fountain pen clipped inside my jacket pocket. It was a custom instrument presented to me years ago, its polished metal cool against my skin. I gripped the pen tightly, using its physical weight to anchor my emotions against the overwhelming wave of humiliation washing over me. I looked directly into Victoria Thorne's eyes, keeping my facial expression entirely calm, neutral, and composed. What Victoria Thorne did not know, and what not a single person seated around that mahogany table could possibly fathom, was that exactly 72 hours earlier, I had executed binding legal documentation transferring majority corporate voting power into my personal portfolio. 2 days before this public humiliation, I had signed papers acquiring 42% of voting shares from our legendary retired founder. Victoria straightened in her chair, a faint smirk of triumph touching her lips as she believed she had successfully orchestrated a public show of absolute authority. She genuinely believed this morning would be remembered in corporate history as the defining moment of her ascension. She had no idea that this scene was not her triumph at all. It was merely the opening spark of a reckoning she was entirely unprepared to face. The hallway outside remained silent as the weight of the moment settled over the executive floor. I could see my reflection in the dark glass windows, a man who had dedicated his prime years to building supply chains across the globe, standing firm against corporate arrogance. The bright red tulips on the mahogany credenza were no longer a symbol of welcoming a new colleague. They had become a silent witness to a transition that would reshape the destiny of Apex Global Logistics forever. I picked up the manila envelope containing the termination papers and slipped it calmly into my leather briefcase. There was no need for angry outbursts, dramatic gestures, or desperate pleas. In the high-stakes world of corporate governance, those who react with emotional volatility often lose their strategic advantage. I knew that every word spoken in this boardroom, every contemptuous remark uttered by Victoria Thorne, was being carefully observed by the junior staff. I intended to give them a lesson in absolute dignity. As I walked out of the suite, the quiet click of the glass door closing behind me sounded like the ticking of a clock. The countdown had begun, and 72 hours of calculated silence were about to yield a harvest of corporate justice that no spreadsheet could ever predict. The chain of extraordinary events that brought me to this corporate crisis had begun late on a quiet Sunday evening, 72 hours before Victoria Thorne handed me my termination envelope. I had been sitting in the quiet library of my home, attempting to lose myself in an operational manual to drown out the growing corporate rumors surrounding the incoming chief executive officer. Suddenly, my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the polished oak desk. The caller identification flashing across the digital screen made my chest tighten. The name displayed was Walter Hayes. Walter was 82 years old and the legendary founder of Apex Global Logistics. He had built the company from a single regional trucking line into an international freight giant before retiring. 3 years earlier, weary of endless governance disputes with speculative investment funds. Though he rarely visited headquarters, his founding principles still lingered in every operational manual and freight policy. When Walter Hayes called your personal line, you answered immediately. Raymond? Walter's voice came through the speaker, deep, steady, and deliberate. I need you to come to my private residence immediately. We have a matter of utmost urgency to settle before the board convenes. 20 minutes later, I was seated in the expansive, leather-scented study of Walter's historic coastal estate. Walter sat behind a heavy walnut desk, a neat stack of legal documents arranged meticulously before him. Despite his advanced age, his eyes possessed the sharp, razor-like focus of a leader who possessed 40 years of strategic foresight. Raymond, Walter began, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the desk. I have watched the board of directors over the past 6 months. They are bringing in Victoria Thorne not to strengthen our logistics operations, but to carve up our core assets, squeeze short-term dividends, and dismantle everything we spent 25 years building. I refuse to allow predatory financial speculators to destroy our legacy. He slid the stack of legal papers across the desk toward me. I am executing a private equity transfer. I am selling my entire remaining voting block, 42% of super voting Class A shares, directly to you. Combined with your existing operational equity, you will hold complete majority voting control of Apex Global Logistics. I stared at the heavy legal documents, my pulse quickening. Walter, this represents millions of dollars in corporate equity and voting control. Why entrust this massive power to me? Because you have sacrificed more for this firm than anyone else, Walter replied, his voice softening with immense personal respect. You understand that a logistics company is built on human trust, physical reliability, and long-term relationships, not predatory restructuring. Walter reached into his desk drawer and extracted a heavy silver fountain pen. He held it up to the warm light before placing it carefully into my palm. This pen was in my hand when I signed the original founding charter of Apex 25 years ago. It is not merely a writing instrument. It is a physical symbol of stewardship. If you sign these documents, Raymond, you become the legal guardian of this enterprise. I took the silver pen, feeling its reassuring weight. I signed my full legal name across the transfer documents, the blue ink gliding smoothly over the crisp parchment. When I finished, Walter looked at me with severe intensity. One vital condition, Raymond. You must keep this equity transfer completely secret for 72 hours. Let Victoria Thorne and her allies reveal their true motives when they believe you possess no authority. Under Delaware General Corporation Law Section 228 and our governance bylaws, majority share equity overrides executive power. Let their own hubris expose them before you step forward. Now, back in the present on Thursday afternoon, I walked back into my corner office carrying a plain cardboard box. The long hallway was thick with uncomfortable silence. Staff members lowered their heads as I passed, burdened by the quiet grief that accompanies an obvious corporate injustice. Inside my office, I began gathering 25 years of memories. I packed framed photographs of international port completions, heavy binders of supply chain audits, my chipped ceramic coffee mug, and a heavy bronze paperweight presented to me by harbor workers after we resolved the 2018 dock strike. As I packed, memories pressed heavy on my mind. I thought of the brutal blizzard of 2015 when severe ice storms paralyzed global shipping corridors. I had spent 36 consecutive hours inside the emergency war room, personally rerouting hundreds of freight trucks to deliver critical medical supplies across 3 states. That was the exact weekend my father passed away. I had missed his memorial service to keep the company's contracts intact, a silent scar I carried every single day. I slid the final binder into the box. Just as I prepared to pick it up, my personal phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from David Miller, a veteran supply chain manager who had worked beside me for 15 years. "No one on the operational floors will ever forget what you built here, Raymond," the message read. "Titles change, but true leadership remains." I smiled faintly, placing the phone in my pocket. My sacrifices had not been in vain. The foundation was solid and the true test was about to begin. Walking down the familiar corridors of headquarters with my box of belongings, I felt a deep, reflective stillness. Every painting on the wall, every plaque commemorating successful port expansions in Asia and Europe, represented thousands of hours of collective labor. The corporate raiders and hedge fund managers who frequented executive suites often viewed companies as abstract financial instruments to be bought, leveraged, and discarded. But to those of us who spent our lives managing the physical movement of goods across oceans, a corporation was a living, breathing community. When I reached the main lobby, several veteran logistics coordinators were standing near the security desk. They did not speak, knowing that corporate security guards were watching, but their solemn nods and handshakes communicated an unshakable solidarity. I shook each of their hands warmly, offering a quiet word of encouragement. "Keep the fleets moving," I told them softly as I pressed the elevator button for the ground floor. Systems endure long after temporary managers depart. As the elevator doors closed, isolating me in the quiet cab, I felt the silver fountain pen resting securely against my heart. Walter Hayes had given me more than equity. He had entrusted me with the soul of the company. The upcoming confrontation in the boardroom would not merely settle a personal grievance. It would determine whether integrity still had a place at the highest levels of American enterprise. By Thursday evening, the executive suite on the top floor of headquarters was vibrating with a cold, aggressive energy. Though I was no longer physically present in the building, news within a major logistics enterprise travels with extraordinary speed through encrypted channels and private staff networks. Victoria Thorne had summoned the entire senior leadership team to a mandatory evening strategy session, and her performance was designed to solidify her total authority over the corporation. Later, that evening, I received a detailed report from a trusted colleague who had attended the session. Victoria had walked into the executive auditorium with absolute swagger, as though she owned not only the physical corporate building, but the very livelihood of every manager seated inside. She wasted no time on professional courtesy, strategic analysis, or transitional pleasantries. "We are officially terminating the era of sentimental management," Victoria announced loudly, pacing slowly across the raised stage, with her hands clasped behind her back. Her voice echoed sharply off the acoustic paneling. "This corporation has carried far too much obsolete infrastructure for far too many years. Moving forward, sentimentality will be treated as an operational liability." That phrase, repeated secondhand to me, struck with deliberate cruelty. Obsolete infrastructure. That was her sleek corporate label for 25 years of dedicated service, strategic sacrifice, and unblemished operational integrity. She was not merely replacing an executive officer. She was attempting to systematically erase 2 decades of hard-earned company history. Sitting in my quiet home study, my chest tightened with a surge of cold, focused indignation. I could accept a legitimate executive restructuring, but I could not tolerate the open contempt she displayed toward the men and women who had built the very ground she walked on. Victoria's speech had continued with escalating arrogance. "Starting tomorrow morning," she declared to the nervous executives, "we will cut deeper into our core divisions. Departments bloated with historical sentiment, specifically risk management, regulatory compliance, and internal logistics, will be dismantled and streamlined. Anyone exhibiting hesitation or loyalty to outdated operational methods will be terminated immediately without severance." Her words were brutal, but the deeper tragedy lay in the passive silence of the senior board members present. Experienced directors who knew the operational risks of her hasty cuts sat motionless, choosing personal career survival over professional integrity. Then, an unexpected turn of corporate fate occurred at 11 o'clock that night. My phone chimed with a secure digital file transfer. The sender was Jason Reed, a brilliant 28-year-old supply chain analyst whom I had personally mentored 6 years ago when he joined the firm as a fresh graduate. Jason had been sitting in the second row of the auditorium during Victoria's address, his tablet open, quietly recording high-definition audio of the entire meeting. Attached to the audio file was a brief note from Jason. "Raymond, you need to hear this immediately. They cannot be allowed to destroy this company and ruin your reputation. We are all standing behind you." I clicked play on the digital media player. Victoria's voice filled my study, crisp, clear, and unmistakable. Relics like Raymond Vance were heavy anchors weighing down our profit margins. Her recorded voice sneered, dripping with unrestrained condescension. "We made his public termination a deliberate spectacle to show everyone in this firm that no one is immune. Furthermore, we will bypass standard Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act notice requirements for the upcoming logistics layoffs by reclassifying their dismissals as performance failures." My grip tightened around the edge of my desk as I listened. Victoria had not only displayed severe personal malice, but she had explicitly outlined intentional violations of federal labor law and corporate fiduciary standards under Delaware jurisdiction. She had documented her own breach of the duty of loyalty owed to the corporation and its shareholders. A slow, steady smile formed on my face in the quiet darkness of my study. Victoria believed she had delivered a masterclass in executive intimidation. In reality, her unrestrained arrogance had handed me the exact legal evidence required to dismantle her tenure before it even truly began. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the silver fountain pen given to me by Walter Hayes. I laid it neatly beside my laptop next to the draft of my emergency corporate resolution. The stage was set for Friday morning's mandatory board meeting. Victoria Thorne believed she held the keys to the kingdom, completely unaware that the legal locks had already been changed. Later that night, as rain began to patter gently against the window panes of my home study, I replayed Jason Reed's audio recording for a third time. Listening to Victoria Thorne's cold, calculated voice, I analyzed her strategy with the practiced precision of an experienced logistics strategist. She was operating under the mistaken belief that fear and aggressive severance cuts would force compliance across all departments. She failed to realize that when you strip shucks away respect and dignity from a workplace, you dismantle the very motivation that keeps complex operational systems functioning smoothly. Her explicit plan to bypass Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act notice periods by falsely labeling veteran employees as performance failures was not just unethical. It was a severe legal liability under federal statutes and Delaware corporate law. Under Section 228 of the Delaware General Corporation Law, majority shareholders possess full legal standing to halt unauthorized executive actions that expose the firm to massive regulatory litigation. I drafted my legal response meticulously, using my laptop to format the emergency shareholder resolutions. Every clause was backed by statutory authority, corporate bylaws, and verified financial data. I was not seeking destructive revenge. I was constructing a legally unassailable framework to restore stability and justice to Apex Global Logistics. When I finished typing, I printed the documents on thick parchment paper and placed them neatly inside my leather folder beside the silver fountain pen. Friday morning arrived under a crisp, gray autumnal sky. By 8:30, the executive conference suite on the top floor of Apex Global Logistics was bustling with high-stakes corporate anticipation. The quarterly emergency board of directors meeting had been convened, a high-level gathering called specifically to ratify Victoria Thorne's sweeping restructuring plan and confirm her new executive appointments. The grand conference room was an intimidating architectural space. A massive 20-foot mahogany table polished to a mirror finish dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather executive chairs. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a sweeping panorama of the downtown skyline and the bustling commercial shipping port below. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat an executive chair that immediately drew hushed whispers from the arriving board members. Positioned directly at the head of the table, a heavy polished brass placard rested quietly on the wood. Engraved across its surface in bold capital letters were the words, "Reserved, Majority, Voting Shareter." The presence of the placard created an immediate undercurrent of anxiety among the 12 board directors. Several senior members exchanged subtle, cautious glances over their morning coffee, while others huddled in quiet corners, quietly speculating on the identity of the mysterious equity investor. A majority voting shareholder possessed the absolute legal authority under Delaware General Corporation Law to remove directors, veto restructuring plans, and overturn executive decisions with a single written consent. Victoria Thorne entered the boardroom at 10 minutes to 9, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and radiating supreme confidence. She noticed the nervous glances directed toward the brass placard, but immediately turned the uncertainty to her personal advantage. Stepping up to the head of the room with an easy, practiced smile, Victoria tapped her leather folder against the podium to capture everyone's attention. "Good morning. Members of the board," she began, her tone dripping with polished charm. "I am fully aware of the curiosity surrounding the updated majority shareholder seat. I am pleased to inform you that our new primary equity partner aligns completely with my modern vision for aggressive corporate reform. Their absence at this opening session is merely a formal formality. You may consider that reserved chair as a silent, absolute endorsement of the executive actions we are taking today." Her smooth words succeeded in easing the tension in the room. Several directors nodded in relief, settling back into their leather seats, eager to proceed with the routine voting procedures. They were accustomed to distant institutional investors who remained passive as long as quarterly stock valuations increased. Meanwhile, out in the wide marble hallway, just beyond the frosted glass double doors, I stood quietly beside the elevator bank. I was dressed in a tailored navy suit, my posture upright, calm, and completely relaxed. Inside my right breast pocket, the silver fountain pen rested securely against my chest. Its cool metallic presence served as a constant physical reminder of the trust Walter Hayes had placed in my hands 72 hours ago. Through the translucent glass paneling, I could observe the vague silhouettes of the board members moving inside. I listened to the muffled cadence of Victoria's voice as she began her formal slide presentation, boasting about cost-cutting projections and operational dismissals. Every natural impulse in my body urged me to push open those double doors immediately and end her charade. But 25 years of managing complex logistics had taught me that tactical timing is everything. To maximize the impact of legal truth, one must allow arrogance to reach its absolute zenith before delivering the final strike. Inside the boardroom, Victoria reached the climax of her presentation. "With your formal votes today," she announced passionately, "we will officially eliminate the obsolete logistics divisions and confirm the executive terminations executed yesterday." She raised her hand to call for the motion. All those in favor of ratifying the executive restructuring plan. Before a single director could raise a hand, the heavy boardroom door opened abruptly. The executive secretary, pale, breathless, and holding a digital tablet with trembling hands, hurried straight toward Victoria. "Miss Thorne, you need to stop the vote right now," the secretary whispered, her voice cracking loudly enough to echo through the silent room. "Official legal notices just hit every corporate tablet." Victoria frowned in sharp irritation. "Whatever it is, it can wait until after the formal vote." "No, it cannot," the secretary insisted, turning the digital screen directly toward the board members. Simultaneously, 12 corporate tablets arrayed around the mahogany table chimed in unison with high-priority legal notifications. The documents displayed were certified electronic filings from the Delaware Division of Corporations and the Securities and Exchange Commission's Schedule 13D Registry. The official filing notice read clearly across every screen. "Notification of equity control transfer. Effective Tuesday morning, Raymond Vance holds 40% of super voting class heirs in Apex Global Logistics. This filing supersedes all prior administrative records. Effective immediately, board recognition of majority voting control is mandatory." An absolute, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Chairs creaked as directors leaned forward in absolute shock, scanning the legal text again and again. Victoria Thorne stood frozen at the podium, the color draining completely from her face as the ground beneath her corporate authority collapsed. The tension in the marble hallway outside the boardroom reached a fever pitch as 9 o'clock approached. Through the translucent glass panels, I could see the 12 board directors reviewing their digital agendas, oblivious to the legal storm gathering overhead. Victoria Thorne stood at the head of the mahogany table like a commanding officer addressing a captive audience, completely confident that her authority was absolute. Standing beside the elevator bank, I took a long, measured breath, allowing the quiet discipline of 25 years of executive experience to center my mind. Corporate battles are rarely won by loud declarations or theatrical hostility. They are decided by thorough preparation, unyielding adherence to legal truth, and absolute emotional control. Inside the boardroom, the unexpected chime of 12 corporate tablets, signaling certified legal filings, created an instant shift in the atmosphere. The directors, who had spent years navigating complex regulatory compliance, immediately recognized the binding authority of a Delaware Division of Corporations filing and an SEC Schedule 13D disclosure. The legal documentation was unambiguous: 42% of super voting. Class A shares were officially held by Raymond Vance, granting absolute majority voting control. Victoria Thorne's expression of supreme confidence vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale, hollow shock as she realized that her public performance yesterday had been witnessed by the very man who now held total legal dominion over her executive tenure. The silence inside the executive conference suite was thick, suffocating, and absolute. Every single eye around the 20-foot mahogany table remained glued to the digital screens displaying the certified Delaware corporate filing. Before Victoria Thorne could utter a single word to spin the revelation, the heavy frosted glass double doors swung open slowly and deliberately. I walked into the boardroom. I did not hurry my pace, nor did I display any outward sign of anger or triumph. I walked with the calm, measured stride of a leader who belonged in that room by right of 25 years of dedicated service and undisputed legal ownership. In my right hand, I held the polished silver fountain pen, its metal cap glinting under the recessed ceiling lights. Victoria spun around at the lectern, her manicured hands clutching the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her carefully crafted executive facade fractured completely, exposing raw, panic-stricken disbelief underneath. This is an outrageous system error, Victoria stammered, her voice wavering dangerously, losing all of its former commanding cadence. Raymond Vance was publicly terminated yesterday under my direct executive authority. He has no legal standing in this boardroom. I did not interrupt her. I continued walking slowly down the length of the long mahogany table, letting the heavy silence of the room press down upon everyone present. The 12 board directors sat motionless, watching me with wide, astonished eyes. I stopped at the head of the table, directly beside the high-backed executive chair marked with the brass placard, "Reserved, Majority Voting Sherator." I rested my left hand lightly on the back of the leather chair, looking straight across the table into Victoria's eyes. Under Delaware General Corporation Law Section 228 and Article 4 of our corporate charter, I said, my voice calm, deep, and carrying total authority, executive administrative power ends precisely where majority equity voting control begins. Your summary termination of my position yesterday was not only legally void, but it constituted a direct breach of fiduciary duty owed to the majority equity holders of this corporation. Victoria gasped, taking a step back from the podium. The board will not support this ambush. We are modernizing this company. The board serves at the pleasure of the majority voting equity, I replied quietly. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek USB drive containing Jason Reed's whistleblower recording and financial audit evidence. I placed it gently onto the mahogany table next to my silver pen. Furthermore, I continued, this drive contains full audio documentation of your address last night, including your explicit statements outlining intentional violations of Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act standards and fraudulent concealment of operational liabilities. Under corporate governance bylaws, those actions constitute grounds for immediate executive suspension for cause. A murmur of total shock swept around the table. Charles Montgomery, the senior board director who had sat quietly through yesterday's drama, stood up slowly. He reviewed the electronic document on his tablet, then looked at Victoria with grave severity. The filings are fully certified by corporate legal counsel, Charles announced loudly to the room. Raymond Vance is the majority shareholder of Apex Global Logistics. His authority is absolute. Charles turned toward me, extending his hand. Welcome back, Raymond. One by one, 6 other board members stood up, nodding their agreement, completely abandoning Victoria Thorne as they realized the balance of power had permanently shifted. The executive house of cards she had built on arrogance and fear collapsed in less than 5 minutes. I pulled back the leather chair at the head of the table and sat down. The creak of the leather echoed through the room like a final judicial gavel. I picked up the silver fountain pen, unscrewed the cap, and placed a clean corporate resolution paper in front of me. I looked directly at Victoria Thorne, who stood pale, trembling, and utterly defeated at the far end of the room. Victoria, I said evenly, my tone devoid of malice or personal vindication. Your attempt to eliminate our core operational foundation is officially terminated. Effective immediately, your executive powers are suspended pending a complete independent audit by the board of directors. During this interim period, you will report directly to my office. Victoria sank weakly into the nearest empty chair, unable to offer a single word of defense. Her reign of intimidation was over. I pressed the tip of the silver fountain pen to the paper, signing my full legal name across the official board resolution, restoring our logistics operations and protecting our workforce. The smooth scratch of the pen on parchment marked the formal closure of the corporate war. As I gathered my papers and slipped the silver pen back into my breast pocket, a deep sense of quiet liberation filled my chest. Liberation had not come through loud shouting or bitter revenge. It had arrived through unwavering patience, strict legal discipline, and the enduring power of true integrity. I walked out of the boardroom into the bright morning sunlight streaming through the lobby, ready to lead the enterprise I had helped build, knowing that real leadership is never defined by a temporary title, but by the lasting foundation you leave behind. As I finished signing the official board resolution with Walter's silver fountain pen, The atmosphere inside the grand conference room transformed completely. The oppressive weight of intimidation that Victoria Thorne had brought to headquarters was replaced by a palpable sense of relief and renewed confidence. The 12 board members, recognizing that the corporation's operational foundation was once again secure, expressed their unanimous commitment to restoring our original supply chain standards. Victoria Thorne sat motionless in her chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. Her rapid rise through corporate restructuring had come to a sudden, absolute halt against the immovable wall of majority equity ownership and unyielding legal truth. She had learned a permanent lesson. In the world of real enterprise, arrogance and ruthless maneuvering will always be defeated by patient stewardship, deep institutional knowledge, and true integrity. I stood up from the majority shareholder chair, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and picked up my leather briefcase. I offered a warm, professional nod to Charles Montgomery and the assembled directors. "Gentlemen," I said calmly, "let us return to the work of building a company that honors its people and delivers on its promises." I walked out of the executive suite and down the wide marble hallway, where news of the boardroom reckoning had already spread to the operational floors. Staff members smiled openly, exchanging quiet handshakes of celebration. As I stepped out into the crisp morning air near the commercial harbor, watching our freight ships loading cargo against the horizon, I knew that the future of Apex Global Logistics was bright, secure, and built to last.